Hello, everyone. Back in 1989, a British economist called John Harold Williamson came up with a term called the Washington Consensus to describe the kind of ruling zeitgeist amongst governments and economists of how to run the world economy. It was very much based on free market principles, maybe a mixture of Mrs. Thatcher and Ronald Reagan. A lot has happened, of course, since 1989. My guest today, Andres Velasco, is an academic. He's a dean at the London School of Economics. He's also the former Minister of Finance of Chile. He was born in Santiago. He lives now in London. And he, with some colleagues, have been rethinking this consensus and shaping a new one, shaping a 21st century policy consensus, which they're tentatively describing or calling the London Consensus in a new book that he edited with a couple of colleagues. He's joining us from London. Andres, welcome. Perhaps before we begin with your London Consensus, how would you broadly define what this Washington Consensus meant and its significance for the last part of the 20th century?
Well, it meant a fair bit in that it was very influential. If you go back to 1990, 1995, many countries were following these policy recipes. Places like the World Bank and the IMF were telling countries to follow these recipes. So it made a big difference. Some of the things in the Washington Consensus made sense back then, and they still do. You don't want to run huge budget deficits. You don't want to borrow too much and then have a debt crisis. You don't want to have an entirely closed economy. Those are not bad ideas. But other things like, complete and immediate deregulation or privatization were probably not such good ideas. And in some places, the Washington Consensus did some good. In other places, it did some harm. Now, one historical note, John Williamson, whom you mentioned, was actually a member of the Labour Party in the UK. He was a centre-left guy, but he ran this conference, published this manuscript, and it became branded as very right-wing, even though John himself was not. In fact, he was left of centre.
Yeah, and it's no coincidence, of course, that it was called the Washington Consensus, since it was so US-centric.
Actually, it is called the Washington Consensus because there was a conference that took place in Washington. Many of the people writing in the original book were not American. Williamson was British. And the conference happened in reaction mostly to the big debt crisis in Latin America in the 80s. So again, it ended up being identified with the US and Washington, but the genesis of the whole thing was not US at all.
Is it any coincidence, though, Andres, that this came out in 1989? Fukuyama, of course, infamously called that year, with the fall of the Berlin Wall, the end of history. How is the Washington Consensus connected with what some people see as a kind of rather hubristic vision in the West of the victory of free market capitalism?
There's a fair bit of that. And as you correctly point out, it is not a coincidence that this is happening in 89, 1990. I would say that the main shortcoming of the book and of the recipe, and it is connected to what you're saying.
And when you're saying the book, you mean Williamson's book?
Exactly. I mean, the Washington Consensus is actually a document, and it was published in a book that came out in 1990. And, Williamson wrote the introduction, so that's why he is sort of the father of the whole thing. But, you're asking, is it an American product? Is there a bit of arrogance? I would say that there is a bit of arrogance in that it was very much a one-size-fits-all kind of recipe. And therefore, some of the ideas may have been right for some countries at some times, but the idea that here are 10 commandments and this is what you do, no matter where you are, who you are, north or south, east or west, rich or poor, these are the 10 things you need to do. That certainly smacks of hubris.
Speaking of Ten Commandments, if there was a Moses of the Washington Consensus, or perhaps two Moses, a male and female, I mentioned Reagan and Thatcher earlier, would it be fair to say that Williamson's notion of a Washington Consensus was a brew of Thatcherism and Reaganism and this hostility to Keynesian economics and the role of the state in any kind of economic endeavor?
Yes and no. Although you may be surprised to hear this, but probably more influential than Reagan or Thatcher were the people who ran places like Argentina and Chile back in the 1980s. They were doing Reaganism long before Reagan, and they were doing Thatcherism long before Thatcher. And as I said, this conference that gave rise to the volume took place in response to the big mess that Latin America had been in the 1980s. You might remember there was something called the Latin American debt crisis, and it almost brought down big American banks like Citibank and Chemical Bank. And that's why Washington was so concerned about this. So yes, there is a brew of sort of free market thinking, some of it coming from the US and the UK, some of it originating at the University of Chicago, of course, in the United States, but very much spreading through the world. And in fact, seeing some of its more extreme applications, not just in Thatcher's Britain, but again, in places like Argentina and Chile. Now, the footnote, of course, is that Williamson himself was not a Thatcherite. He was not a graduate of the University of Chicago. He was a mildly left of center guy, but he got branded this way. I'm pretty sure he didn't like it.
But was he, this idea of a London, not a London, we're going to get to your London consensus in a few minutes, but the idea of a Washington consensus that Williamson put together, he was observing, he wasn't necessarily approving it, he was simply stating a fact, wasn't he?
That's about right. In fact, he described it as a consensus in Washington, meaning what are people in Washington thinking is the right thing to do, and what are places like the World Bank and the IMF prescribing to the countries that come borrow, and in exchange for the money, places like the World Bank say you have to do this, that, and the other. This list of 10 commandments was more or less the conventional wisdom at the time.
You mentioned Argentina and Chile a couple of times. As I said in the introduction, you're a former Minister of Finance of Chile. The Chicago boys, and we've done shows on this in the past, the Chicago boys came down to Chile and, at least in my understanding, pretty much wrecked the economy. Is that fair?
No, that's not quite fair. First of all, the Chicago boys were Chilean, so they didn't come down from anywhere. Many of them did go to school in Chicago, but they were Chilean nationals. There's one original sin that they committed. These are mostly economists working under the very, very nasty dictatorship of General Pinochet. So a lot of the policies they carried out bear that imprint. And, my family was exiled by Pinochet, so believe me, I have very little sympathy with that. Now, if I put on my head as an economist, I would say that some of the things they did made sense. Argentina and Chile had been very closed economies. They lowered tariffs. They did the opposite of what Mr. Trump is doing today. That made some sense. Bringing budget deficits under control also made some sense. But as I said at the outset, wild and crazy deregulation didn't make any sense, especially when it came to finance. What brought the Chicago boy experiments down in Uruguay, in Argentina, in Chile was excessive deregulation of finance. So local banks went on a borrowing binge, and one good day in the early 80s, they found themselves with way too much debt and unable to pay. So in the early 80s already, this experiment in places like Chile and Argentina was, I won't say coming to a halt, but it was certainly experiencing a big crisis. 82, 83 were the crisis years. So again, some of the ideas were reasonable, some of them were quite unsound, and they did get some countries into big trouble.
One more question before we get to the London consensus, Andres. You mentioned democracy. You mentioned the fact that your family was exiled from Chile. Many victims of one kind of dictatorship or other in Latin America, Argentina, Chile, Brazil.
That's right.
What in at least Williamson's notion of the Washington Consensus was the assumption between democracy and economic development. Was it somehow assumed that if countries like Chile or Argentina or Brazil could become wealthier, then their democracies would proceed accordingly?
That is actually a very key point. And in the London Consensus, we put politics at the center.
But leaving, we'll get to the London Consensus in a second.
But the two things are related because we are reacting to precisely the point that you're making. One way of saying this is that the Washington Consensus was very naive about politics. Naive in two senses. First of all, it assumed that you could impose policies top down and that they would naturally simply set in and last. We learned that that is not the case. If policies don't have some local ownership, if people don't believe that those policies are their policies, they will not be long-lived. And if people expect the policies to end, they will not be effective. But that's one kind of naivete. The other kind of naivete is that back in the 80s, people in Washington said, well, let's sort out the economics. And if countries grow, they will naturally, remain democratic or turn democratic if they were not democratic to begin with. And that, of course, is very naive. Nothing guarantees that as you get rich, you also get more liberal and democratic. We've seen China get rich, and China is certainly no more democratic today than it was 20 years ago. So the idea that you sort out the economics and the politics will take care of itself, I think is proven completely wrong.
What about the political scientists who may have been associated with the Washington Consensus? I mean, what would Fukuyama, for example, he was on the show earlier this year, what would he have said at the time about the Washington Consensus and relatively mainstream conservatives like him in Washington, D.C.?
I'm not quite sure what Frank Fukuyama would have said. I'm not sure he would call himself a conservative either. He would probably call himself a liberal in the British
sense. Well, a liberal conservative in the best sense. I don't mean to be critical.
He might have. I mean, I wouldn't want to put words in his mouth, but if I had to guess, he would have said something that is not radically different from what I've been saying, namely, some of these reforms, like cutting down on debt, opening up the economy, were desirable and long overdue, but that some of the deregulation, some of the privatization, some of the rush to change things without building the proper structures and the proper institutions and the proper regulatory frameworks, he might have been skeptical about. That's a guess.
So let's move on to your 21st century policy consensus, which you're hammering out, or at least raising in the London Consensus. Between 1989, when Williamson came up with his idea of the Washington Consensus, and today, 2025, very briefly, Andres, I mean, I know this is a rather big question, but has the Washington Consensus been destroyed in the last 36 years?
Destroyed is probably not the right word. It's been challenged. We have learned a lot. We have learned that some of those ideas were sound, some were not sound, and also that the Washington Consensus was incomplete because it dealt with a subset of issues, but many of the issues that people worry about today, whether it be the quality of jobs or income inequality or global warming, and a bunch of other issues, were simply absent back then. And precisely because we felt that economics had changed a lot in the last 35 years, and that the world has changed a lot in the last 35 years, we thought that it would be a useful exercise to invite some of the world's leading economists to sit down. In fact, we had a meeting. It happened 2 years ago in 2023. And the question we asked these economists was, in your subfield, if you do labor markets, if you worry about innovation and economic growth, if you worry about gender and the labor market, if you worry about international trade, in that field, what have you and your colleagues learned since 1989? What was right about the Washington Consensus? What was missing and what was wrong? And what the book tries to do is basically to commit that to paper. The lessons learned since then, the things that need to be done in the same way, but again, many of the things that need to be changed and need to be done differently.
What about the issue, Andres, the difference between 2025 and 1989 is that more and more people don't trust wise or supposedly wise economists like yourself and your colleagues who put the London Consensus together. Is that a fundamental shift? And does that affect how we think of consensuses, whether they're Washington or London based?
I think clearly two things are happening in the world, and they're not welcome changes, but we need to acknowledge them. One is that many people are very skeptical of democracy's ability to deliver and democratic leadership and established political parties. This is true in the US and the UK and Western Europe, but it's also true in India and in South Africa and in Turkey and in Brazil and in Mexico. Pick your favorite country. There is a lot of dissatisfaction with the workings of democracy. And secondly, hand in hand with the first, there is plenty of skepticism about expert knowledge. You will remember that in your country, the country in which I live, back in the days of Brexit, a senior minister was told, well, all the experts are against Brexit. And his answer was, Britain has had enough of experts. We don't want experts. Yes, that is very much the case. Problem is, we still need experts. I mean, if I go to the dentist, I want a dentist who's pulled teeth before. If I'm going to design economic policies, I need to at least have a conversation with people who've spent decades thinking about how economic policy is crafted. But I grant you the point. The economists are not going to be granted credibility or legitimacy sort of by the stroke of a pen. Any expert, any politician, anybody who aspires to a role of leadership today has to earn that credibility. And the beginning of that process is simply saying, this is what we believe, these are the lessons, and this is the conversation we'd like to have. And that's the sort of thing that we're trying to do with this book.
You came up with a nice term, I discovered, Deliveroo politics. And this seems to be bound up in what people expect of their experts, their politicians these days. What is Deliveroo politics, and how does that play into the difference perhaps between the world of the Washington Consensus and your London Consensus of 2025?
Well, Deliveroo politics is a term that I use in a column that came out quite literally a couple of weeks ago.
It's a nice term. You should write a book called that.
Thank you. I am writing a book in which I will probably use it. The idea is this: Deliveroo, as you know, if you live in a country where the app works, will bring home will bring food, to your front door in record time. People expect delivery. People expect things to be delivered to them quickly. And one explanation of why democracy is not being valued by citizens is that, in some places, democracy is not delivering, whether it's not delivering economic growth or good jobs at good wages, whether it's not delivering nice, clean-handed politicians, etc. And this is, of course, a big issue. We want democracy to deliver. We want people to have good jobs and good homes and good healthcare. But in addition to that, the point that I was making in that column is that even in countries in which you see a fair bit of economic growth, in which you see jobs being created, people still seem very dissatisfied with the workings of democracy. One example I gave in the column was Poland. In the 35 years since 1990, Poland is the second fastest growing economy in the world after China. 35 years ago, Poles were poor. Today, Poles have roughly the same standard of living as the Japanese. Never in the history of Poland have people lived better than they do today. And nonetheless, Poland is a very divided society, bitterly split between conservatives and liberals, between Democrats and populists, between the countryside and the city. So the Deliveroo bit of it is part of what is missing in democracy. But there seems to be something else, which is political, which has to do with the kinds of things you and I were talking about a minute ago. The credibility of politicians, the credibility of institutions, the degree to which people think that the system is working for them and not for somebody else, conflicts about migration, conflicts about culture. All of that has to be put into a blender if we want to understand why people are so upset, why they're voting for demagogues and populists.
Yeah, it's a nice term, Deliveroo politics. And of course, with AI now, we're supposed to get our politics or our products before we've even thought about them if we're using smart agents. Back in
That's right.
18...
But if I can add one thing, technological change makes people want to, get things much more quickly. But what we have done with democracy is that we've also made democracy much slower in operating because, you live in San Francisco, people are complaining how hard it is to get anything built in California because with the best of intentions, we have created so many regulations and you need so many planning permits and you need to consult so many people and there's so many town councils and citizens groups that have to say something about it that it takes 5 years to get a permit before you can start building a building and 5 more years before you can finish it. And therefore people say, hey, I want more housing. Housing is too expensive in California. Well, good luck getting housing built with the kinds of regulations that we have in place. So we have this tension. On the one hand, technology says, you can get it very quickly, but the reality of democracy is that you cannot get it very quickly. And that is one element making people upset and disappointed.
Yeah, and we've done a number of shows on why nothing is getting built, particularly in the United States. So
well,
if
yeah,
we're to
the
generalize...
UK is not that different, by the way.
Right. If we're to generalize, Andres, over the last 35 years, since 1989, 36 years, is it technology that's changed the world? Is that the key change? Because we've also done a number of shows on how fashion and culture, that doesn't seem to be changing that much, but everything seems to have changed on the technological front. Of course, in 89, everyone thought that the big event was the coming down of the wall in Berlin. But 6 months before the wall came down, Tim Berners-Lee was inventing the internet in Geneva. And perhaps in retrospect, historians will conclude that that was a more important event in 1989, even than the coming down of the Berlin Wall.
I'm not sure which one was more important. As a social scientist, I think Berlin was pretty important, but I see your point. Something we knew back then, but which has become much more evident in the years since, is that societies get richer when they get more productive, and productivity is very much linked to technology. One of our co-authors in this book that we're talking about just won the Nobel Prize a week ago, a guy called Philippe Aghion, who's my colleague at the London School of Economics, and his main point is that growth is all about innovation, and innovation is very much the deployment of technology. So in that sense, the tech revolution has been absolutely key. At the same time, I think that if you look at it from a purely political perspective, we had high hopes for technology when it came to democracy. When we all got WhatsApp and social media, we all, people said, oh, this is going to be great for democracy because now every citizen is empowered. I'm not so sure that's true. Many people would argue that social media have debased politics. Many people would claim that we now get informed in ways that are very misleading and very easy to manipulate. So yeah, technology has been great when it comes to productivity. It's been less than great when it comes to its influence on politics.
The great debate, of course, that supposedly the Berlin Wall, the fall of the Berlin Wall ended was the economic and political debate between, I don't know what you call it, free market capitalism, free market liberalism, and Soviet-style communism. What's the key debate today, especially amongst economists, Andres? When you meet your colleagues, the kind of people who have committed to this book, leading economists, as you say, one of your colleagues just won the Nobel Prize for his work on technology and progress. What is the great debate? What is the issue that divides and stimulates leading economists in the world?
I'm not sure there is one debate, and I'm not sure there should be one. The big clash of the titans between markets and socialism or communism of a generation or two ago was not that fruitful, really, because markets were always desirable, but markets always needed a state and needed regulation. One of the messages of our book is precisely that you need a market, but you also need a state. And in fact, that markets don't work without states. You need a market because it's good that people should be able to make choices and trade and decide what they want to eat and where they want to work and which profession they want to have. But you cannot buy or sell a house without a set of rules and regulations and the guarantee that somebody will enforce the law. and you cannot borrow to buy a house unless you have a financial market, and the financial market is also going to need some pretty sophisticated sets of regulations and rules. So a capable state is absolutely key, alongside a fairly vigorous and dynamic market. I think most economists would agree with the proposition. You ask me, what is the debate? Well, the debate is, once you get into the nitty gritty. So exactly what kind of regulation in the financial market, exactly what kind of regulation in the housing market, exactly what kind of regulation when it comes to jobs. And some people would say, well, you need really tight regulation when it comes to housing in California. And other people would say, oh, no, you've overdone it. You needed some, but not so much. And I think that's where the interesting debates are, not the big ideological or, black and white, good and bad debates, but a much finer debate on what kinds of regulations, what kinds of government intervention. It's much more in the middle. And, this book is trying to capture that. We spend a lot of time, for instance, thinking about what kind of regulation you want to promote innovation. If I think of the work of my colleague we're just talking about, of Philippe Aguillon, he says, look, you want a freewheeling market and you want some
Yeah, the
rents.
name of the title of the chapter in your book from Philippe Aguillon is Fostering Green and Inclusive Productivity Growth.
Exactly.
Rather dry title. I assume it's more interesting in print.
It's very, very interesting, and he says things that are not obvious, and that's what makes it interesting. For instance, you don't want a perfect market in which there are no rents, in which there are no profits. Why do people innovate? Why do people spend many years developing a new technology or a new vaccine? Because they hope to capture some rents, make some profits, right? That's what people are doing in the AI sector right now. But on the other hand, he says, if those profits get too fat, if the rents get too fat, well, those innovators then they get too rich and they begin shutting everybody else out. So the next innovator and the next technology gets shut out. So there's a very, very delicate balance there between competition and rents, between innovation and regulation. I think that's the kind of debate that is interesting today.
What about the debates over tariffs? You've been quite outspoken. You seem to think that tariffs aren't particularly wise. I'm not sure how much you've written about in the book itself. But isn't the great debate now between the globalizers and the economic nationalists, the one that Donald Trump and his ilk seem to have stimulated?
That is one debate, but I think it's important to put it into context. First of all, that is the debate in the rich countries. That is not a debate in the poor countries. You don't see any people advocating closing down the economy, or at least no major movement advocating that in South Africa or in India or in Brazil, because poor countries have won, great advantages from being more integrated into the world economy. And China, of course, is the biggest example of that. So the first thing to keep in mind is that this obsession with closing down the economy, with tariffs, etc., is mostly a rich country debate, and especially it's an American debate. We should not generalize it to the whole world. That's one lesson. The other lesson is that, yes, trade brings winners and losers. And you could make a case that in the United States, there have been some losers, particularly certain kinds of labor in certain American states, in the Midwest, West, and bits of the South, and what's called the Rust Belt. And I think a mistake of the kinds of policies that were adopted after 1989 is that we rushed to liberalize without thinking long and hard about how the people who are left behind might be compensated.
Right. You've even got a term in the book, left behind regions, which I rather
Exactly. And this is a very important thing. What we have learned is that those losses are, not just, not losses only from trade. They're also losses from technology, right? New technologies are great. They create new jobs, but they also destroy jobs. And what we have learned is that these losses are geographically concentrated. They're concentrated in the Rust Belt in the US. They're concentrated in the north of England. And this has consequences for well-being. These left behind regions go into a tailspin. Some people leave, jobs leave, and then you get all kinds of social ills, unemployment, drugs, alcohol, etc., etc. And that is also politically important, because who has been voting for the demagogues and the populists, for the people who have been weakening democratic checks and balances? Well, to some extent, not only people from those left behind regions. So this is about economics, but it's also very much about politics.
One of the first economists to really question the implications of globalization was the Harvard economist Danny Roderick. He's in your book. He has a chapter entitled On Productivism, which sounds intriguing to me. What is Roderick arguing about productivism in 2025 that changes the nature of our global economic consensus?
What Danny Roderick is arguing there, and I have great respect for his work, we used to be colleagues at the Kennedy School at Harvard for many years. Danny is arguing that what the world needs is a good jobs agenda. That, rather than focusing on trade alone, we need to, ask ourselves, what must policy do and what must governments do to ensure that you have good jobs, and that those jobs, have not only decent pay, but also benefits and some say over the nature of the work you do. And that is, about trade, because, trade creates and also destroys jobs. But it's also about technology. A major point that Danny Roderick and his fellow Turkish citizen and Nobelist Darren Acemoglu, they both have been making the same point. Technology is not not something that happens. Technological progress can be guided, and some technologies destroy jobs, but other technologies are complements to human skills and create jobs and improve jobs. So his point is that we should view every policy, including policy toward technology, through that lens. Will it help create jobs, and will those jobs be quality jobs? That's one way of sort of organizing thinking about the kinds of policies that we want. And I think on that score, Danny is very much on the right track.
Yeah, and it's an enormously important point, I think.
Absolutely.
Perhaps the most dramatic economic event since '89 and 2025 was the economic crash of 2007 to 9, the crisis, which almost brought the world economy down. What have we learned from that in terms of restructuring what was once known as the Washington Consensus into what you're calling the London Consensus? How does our experience in the Great Recession, how should it change how we think about economic consensuses in the 2020s?
Should probably change it in many ways, but let me highlight two. One question is, why do these crises keep happening? And one reason why these crises keep happening is that finance is very delicate. Finance is very important, but there are many ways in which finance can go wrong. And, financial shocks themselves can be what destabilizes an economy. You saw that in the UK with the collapse of Northern Rocks and a number of banks. You saw that in the US, of course, with the savings and loan crisis early on. And then, in the crisis we're talking about, with the collapse of many financial intermediaries, big insurance companies like AIG, etc. So the lesson there is, keep an eye on finance, keep an eye on financial deregulation, pursue light touch but firm regulation. Make sure finance does not become a destabilizing source of shocks. I think that is not an entirely new lesson. We learned that, for instance, in these Latin American debt crises I was talking about in the 1980s, but it became all the more powerful and all the more evident after 2007, 8, and 9. Second lesson has to do with how you mop up and what it is that you do in a crisis. And here, one point we make in the book, and I have an essay on this with another colleague from LSE, a guy called Ricardo Reis from Portugal, is that fiscal policy can play a big role in containing the crisis and pulling an economy out of the crisis. Because what happens at a time of a crisis is that financial markets freeze. Firms can borrow, banks can borrow, families and households can borrow. And therefore, many businesses that might have been sound otherwise simply ran out of cash, closed down. You get bankruptcies, you get fire sales of assets, you get a lot of big projects stopped in the middle of construction. That is unnecessary loss. And that is, of course, bad for people's pocketbooks and people's jobs and people's livelihoods. So governments can step in and provide emergency credit, provide guarantees, do what the UK did during COVID, another big crisis, and provide emergency help to firms to make sure firms will not, fire people during a crisis. All of that, we describe as an activist fiscal policy, as the state becoming a lender of last resort, or if you want, an insurer of last resort. Now, that sounds great, and countries have done it, but it comes with two buts. One but is that to be able to borrow in bad times, you have to repay in good times. So this is not an invitation for do whatever you want when it comes to debt and fiscal policy. And secondly is that you want to, borrow a lot and do a lot during the crisis, but once the crisis ends, you need to take your foot off the pedal, off the accelerator. And regrettably, some countries, borrowed a lot during COVID, borrowed a lot during the crisis 15 years ago, and they kept on doing it. And that's why we have over-indebted and a lot of vulnerability today. So you can do these things.
We mentioned your friends in Argentina in all this. You mentioned
not only Argentina. The US has too much debt today.
Right,
the UK has too much debt today.
Well, I think the US is just US seems to me rather just a bigger version of Argentina. You mentioned your former colleague Philippe Aghion. He just won the Nobel Prize for his work on.
Actually, not former colleague, current colleague. He's at the
current colleague at LSE. He had a piece, Fostering Green and Inclusive Productivity Growth, which also included a response by Diane Coyle, who's been on the show before. She has a new book out on the value of GDP. In terms of this idea of fostering green productivity growth, does Aghion and the other economists who are debating all this stuff, are they questioning the idea of GDP, or are they simply saying that there can be something called green economic growth?
Well, they're two separate issues. The whole debate over GDP is a debate about measurement. We don't deal with that in the London Consensus. It's important, but it's not what this project is all about. A different question is whether you can design your pro-growth policies and your pro-innovation policies to emphasize green investment and green growth. And the answer that my two fellow LSE economists provide in that essay is yes, of course you can. It's a little bit like what I was saying before. You can direct innovation to create jobs, and you can also direct innovation to, provide cleaner technologies. Today, we can invest in technologies that didn't exist 25 years ago, to generate electricity using wind, to generate electricity using solar, to generate electricity using tides. That didn't happen, simply by fluke. Some people began doing the research. Some governments helped that research with loans and guarantees and subsidies. And therefore, a country like Chile, where I was born, can provide lots of electricity very cleanly at very reasonable prices. That is the product of good innovation and good research, but it's also the product of good policy. And that's the kind of thing these guys are talking about in that paper.
Finally, Andres, the Washington Consensus, as we said at the beginning, reflected a US-centric world, a unicentric world where America dominated economics and politics. Of course, that's probably no longer the case. This idea of a London Consensus, though, sounds perhaps a little ironic, maybe even sad. I mean, Britain is in profound economic decline. It's always been in decline, but particularly decline now. Europe is in economic crisis, continually poorer than the United States. In fact, you wrote a piece recently asking, why does Europe look so wimpy? Why would anyone take the idea of a London Consensus seriously? Shouldn't we call it a Santiago Consensus or a Rio Consensus or a a Dubai consensus?
Well, if you're asking me that, it suggests that the title was right, because a title has to be attention-catching. And of course, we chose London Consensus because there's a symmetry with the Washington Consensus, and we wanted to point out that we very much aim to say things and propose things that are different from those that were being proposed 35 years ago. Now, if you're thinking that this is the product of about a bunch of Brits who have never left the country and who are pontificating about the world from London and London alone, that would be entirely wrong. If you look at the list of contributors, there are more than 40 people there. Half of those authors actually come from developing countries. I myself, I'm one of the editors. I come from Chile. Danny Roderick, whom you mentioned, comes from Turkey. We have a great essay. You just mentioned Brazil. The great essay in the paper, in the book on inequality, is by Francisco Ferreira, who's Brazilian, and the list goes on and on. The paper on green growth, one of the authors is from Nigeria. Some of the trade stuff was written by people from India. So this is very much a world consensus. It is a very much an international or globally minded effort. We called it the London Consensus because that's what we had the conference. This is where we met. But it is not Britain's proposal for the world. It is a proposal by people from all over the world.
Yeah, you wrote something recently suggesting that we need India, but what about China? Did you have any Chinese contributors? How do you think your idea of a London consensus will go down in Beijing and amongst Chinese economists, official economists or otherwise?
That's a very good question. We've had some exchanges with Chinese economists, but I should emphasize that we were thinking about the interaction between economics and politics mostly in democratic settings. And by democratic settings, I don't mean rich countries. India is a democracy, Brazil is a democracy, South Africa is a democracy. So we are interested in how it is that we use social science to help organize thinking, but we don't pretend that economists will call the shots. These are ideas that ultimately have to be chosen by voters in democratic countries. So that's why many of the contributors or many of the ideas are designed with democratic countries across the world, including developing countries, the Indias, the South Africas, the Turkeys, the Brazils of the world.
Well, there you have it. The London Consensus, co-edited by Andres Velasco from the London School of Economics. Andres, I think perhaps another way of describing it is it's anything but Deliveroo economics. Is that fair?
That's fair. I like